Hello, I'd like to welcome you all to the third lecture in our series in Advanced Political Economy, jointly organized by the New School for Social Research in New York and School of Oriental and African Studies in London. The series has been going very well so far, but today we've got the exceptional pleasure of introducing Duncan Foley to do the third lecture on production and productivity. It is a particular pleasure for me to introduce Duncan because I've been reading his work for a very long time now. Duncan is known for a range of contributions to Marxist political economy, but also to mainstream economics. He's one of these rare people who can comfortably do both, although his heart, I believe, lies with Marxist political economy. He has made contributions that are of particular importance for Marxism and will be so over time. I should start by mentioning, of course, his contribution to theory of money, monetary theory generally, which when he began producing work, it was, in my judgment, the most important work since Suzanne de Brunoff produced her book on Marx and money. I can say more about that, but that's not the time because the topic of the lecture is not money, is a burning issue of contemporary capitalism, that is production, productivity, particularly productivity growth. Duncan's work on this is of exceptional interest because for a number of reasons, but one key factor here is that Duncan is the person who has managed to formalize and in a sense summarize and condense Marxist analysis of the circuit of capital, the classic reference point for Marxist micro but also macroeconomics. We all go back to that, which obviously goes back to the physiocrats and so on. But Duncan's work is particularly important because he has elegantly summed it up, and summed it up in a way that is mathematically advanced and convenient, but also allows conclusions to be reached very easily and formally about what happens as capital traverses its normal path and keeps reproducing itself. Now, reproduction is obviously crucial here for growth, for production and productivity. Duncan's work is important because it allows us to discuss lags, to discuss profitability, to discuss profit, to discuss demand constraint models, and a number of other technical and not so technical issues that are of crucial importance for the development of capitalism. Now, I'm particularly curious to hear what he has to say on the question of production and productivity growth, however, because clearly that is one of the main policy and theory issues of the time, of our time. Productivity growth has been very, very bad, very weak across a number of core capitalist countries the last several decades. The last decade in particular has been appalling. And that's characteristic of how capitalism has moved. And that, of course, goes deep into what capitalism is today and has always been, because productivity growth is embedded in capitalism. It's what defines it. And it hasn't taken place particularly strongly the last decade and more, despite massive technological change. Now, there are many factors involved here. The shifting of production from the core in the West to the East, which still has rapid productivity growth, and so on. So I'd like to hear of any insights Duncan might have to offer on this, but also there are theoretical questions. And here I can't but think of the idea of induced technological change, the idea that Calder put across 60 years ago, and whether that remains important for contemporary capitalism. Calder's idea was, of course, that capital output ratios would be steady, the rate of profit would be steady, capital labor ratio would be rising, productivity would be rising, and that would be capitalism. Well, we don't see that. We don't see that. That might well be why productivity is not rising, or at least it might be worth speculating on that. Anyway, Duncan's work allows us to begin to discuss these things in an organized and coherent way. I don't have anything much more to say. I don't want to say much more. I've said enough, I think. I want to give as much time as possible to Duncan to introduce. Duncan will speak for 40 minutes or so. Then there'll be some quick questions, and then our students will intervene and discuss things further, and then we will open it up to all our participants across the world. So, without further ado, Duncan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Kostas. I don't know whether to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening with a webinar like this, but let me say how glad I am to see Kostas and some of my students from the New School, and to participate in this very interesting initiative, educational and intellectual initiative. I should begin by making a little bit of a disclaimer of fair advertising. The talk is not going to be so much focused on production and productivity, although I will touch on those questions in some detail. Instead, I want to develop three topics. The first one is to review some of the structure of Marx's theory of capitalism, and in particular to understand his theory of the origin of surplus value in the exploitation of productive labor, because I think that without that background, there's a danger of losing sight of the whole framework in which Marx thought about issues like production and productivity. The second topic is going to be the theory of Marx's theory of the falling rate of profit, which I tend to interpret as a theory of a broader theory of technological change, rooted in Ricardo's chapter on machinery. In that section, I will make some remarks on some of the questions that Kostas raised just now, in particular the issue of induced technical change and some possible explanations for the cessation of what Duménil and Lévy call the trajectory a la Marx, or Calder called his stylized facts of capitalist economic growth. And then I'd like to spend a little time at the end of the talk thinking a little bit more broadly about the relation of labor and the exploitation of labor to the regulation of capitalism. And the main example that I'd like to focus your attention on there is actually the Factory Acts, the British Factory Acts, with the idea of trying to link up the what we might understand about the Factory Acts to some broad political strategies for the left in the current world economic and political economic context. I don't have slides, so I'm going to try to keep your attention directly by talking to you. Much of the material that I am going to review is in the background readings that I supplied, which I assume are available to any member of the webinar. If you have any trouble getting those, I can make sure that you do have access to them. So let me begin. Although production and productivity are one theme of these that runs through these discussions, there's another theme that they all, in my view, have in common, and it's very important, which is a more methodological theme, although it has political consequences, which is to understand that how much Marx thought that the outcomes of capitalist social relations were unintended consequences. And therefore, in modern economics, fall into the class of things like prisoner's dilemmas or assurance games, where there's not a linear relationship between the intentions of actors, such as capitalist entrepreneurs, and the outcomes to the actual evolution of the historical situation. So those are the things to look forward to, and I hope I can keep all of these balls in the air as much as possible. So let me take up the first question, which is to point out a couple of things about the basic framework of Marx's analysis of capitalism and the origin of surplus value and the exploitation of labor, which are connected to these questions of unintended consequences. It's pretty, I argue, and I think anybody who reads Capital Volume 1, although that's not so easy to do, given the passage of time and change in terminology that has occurred, can understand that Marx definitely thinks that the origin of, that he's interested in surplus value, that is the increment in value available that is the source of profits, rent, interest, and other flows of value, intellectual property rights, and so forth. He's interested in where that comes from. He thinks that's the most important thing in capitalist society. And he has a very definite answer to it, which is that it comes from the exploitation of productive labor, in the sense that productive laborers expend more labor effort than they are compensated for in the money wage. I think everyone has a pretty good grip on that point. But if you think about what it implies that when a capitalist exploits a productive labor, effectively the capitalist is adding not to their own specific realized surplus value in the form of profit, but to the pool of available surplus value, which that capitalist and all other capitalists and all other competitors for the realization of surplus value can compete over. So in particular, in Marx's framework, there is no relationship between the degree of exploitation in a particular capitalist firm and the realized surplus value in that same firm. And this point, which is at the root of the many controversies about the transformation problem, is a subtle point that's, but one that I think is critical to understanding what's going on. To my mind, if we use more modern game theory language, it implies that each capitalist firm is a free rider on the capitalist system as a whole. In other words, it really doesn't matter whether the capitalist firm exploits labor or doesn't exploit labor, because the contribution of any given capitalist firm to the world pool of unpaid labor is very small. It is true that exploiting labor effectively is one of the most important strategies available to realize surplus value competitively. So this is an example of this unintended consequences thing. The individual capitalist is not really motivated by to exploit labor per se. What the individual capitalist is motivated to do is to put themselves in a competitive position to realize more money surplus value. It turns out that exploiting labor is one of the leading ways they can do it, but not by any means the only one, since there are many other strategies to get competitive advantage. So I think Marx describes this point by saying competition is the force that imposes the laws of the system on the individual agents. And if you stop and think about it, that's exactly the kind of picture that you're getting. The individual capitalist doesn't really care about the pool of surplus value or how much surplus value there is in the system as a whole. All he cares about is how much of it he can realize in competition with other capitalists. There are many consequences of this structure of Marx's theory that we could talk about. But given the limited time today, I'd like to just focus your attention for a moment on a couple of them. So it means that the individual capitalist, well, first of all, it means that the competition among capitals for surplus value is structurally very similar to the kind of competition that's represented in a more mainstream economic theory. Since there's very little difference between competing for surplus value and competing for market share, for example, the difference, if you think about it this way, is not so much that Marx had a different theory of competition, although he certainly has a different theory of competition from the perfect competition fantasies of general equilibrium theory. But it's more that he understands that the background, the underlying background of the process of competition is the existence of this big pool of potential surplus value and unpaid labor that is generated by the capitalist system as a whole. This also, I think, tells us something about Marx's politics, because in Marx's view, what are you going to do about this system if you are on the side of the workers? Well, if you have the system continue in some way, commodity production, money, wage labor, surplus value, he thought that you were going to have a very hard time making any very fundamental changes in people's lives. And so he advocated in his lifetime a strategy of a proletarian revolution to try to end the system as a whole and replace it with something else, probably in his mind, some sort of top-down, mostly top-down, centralized direction of social production. We know now, however, that it's the alternatives of top-down centralized control of social production are very limited and in many ways not very attractive as a way to change people's lives. In particular, we know that there's a tendency, partly as a result of the history of the Soviet Union and of China, but also just from having lived through the 20th century, that there's a tendency for exploitation to reproduce itself in another form, even if there's been a political change in the political basis of the ruling class. So that's about what I want to say on the first topic. If to try to summarize, it's to say that even the very basic process of surplus value exploitation and surplus value creation and realization in Marx's theory are not linear. They are cases of unintended consequences in which it's the side effects of what the capitalists do in order to realize surplus value that creates the pool of surplus value that they realize to begin with. Okay, so let me shift gears here a little bit to the topics that are usually discussed under the rubric of the falling rate of profit in Marx. I think if you read the chapters of volume 3 of Capital where the falling rate of profit is discussed, it's clear that Marx had a much broader understanding of what he was talking about there than just the falling rate of profit itself. And I would say that's in two respects. One is that Marx's theory of the falling rate of profit is a kind of a corollary to his general theory of the increase in the productivity of labor. Why is it that capitalism is so successful in greatly increasing the productivity of labor and therefore making possible some increase in standards of living and the quality of life of large numbers of people? Well, let's think this through for a moment. And the formalism of this is in the paper that I circulated as background for the talk. You can think of an individual capitalist is operating with some particular technique of production at a certain wage, and therefore is maybe selling their output and reaping a certain amount of profit. If that capitalist is offered the chance to adopt some new technique of production, how is the capitalist going to evaluate the new technique of production? Well, what they're going to do is call in their engineers and their accountants and make a spreadsheet model and say, well, look, what would our profits be and profit rate be if we adopted this new technology, this new technique of production? That is often called in the technical literature the viability condition. In other words, a capitalist is not going to be interested in an alternative technique of production unless it seems to promise an improvement in the profit rate. Given, and this is fundamental to this whole idea of unintended consequences and the prisoner's dilemma or Nash equilibrium kind of quality of these arguments, the individual capitalist in making that computation has to take the rate of wages as given, the current rate of wages is given, or possibly might extrapolate growth in the rate of wages if they want to do that. But in any case, the wages are endogenous in that exogenous from the point of view of the individual capitalist. Well, suppose the capitalist does the spreadsheet exercise and finds that the new technique looks like it's going to be more profitable at the given conditions of availability of labor through the wage, and adopts the technique. And let's say it's successful, and this allows the capitalist to, this particular capitalist, to reap some super profits because their costs of production are lower than their competitors due to the innovation that they've done. Well, that's what the capitalist thinks they want to do. But then there's a twist and turn in Marx's argument in which he says, but that's not how it's going to come out. Because the way it's going to come out in the long run is that the rate of profit might very well fall as the result of this adoption of viable techniques of production. Well, how does that happen? The way it happens in Marx is that Marx makes a subtle but very important change in the parameterization of the model, which is to switch the focus from constant wage assumption to arguing that there's a tendency in the capitalist system to a constant value of labor power, which essentially means a constant profit wage ratio over the system as a whole. Well, think about now what happens. So the individual capitalist adopts the innovation and makes super profits, but his competitors catch on and or find equivalent or better ways to do the same thing. And the effect is that the productivity of labor over the system as a whole is increased, which is, from a social point of view, a potentially good thing. But if you assume, as Marx does in this, making this analysis, that the value of labor power stays constant, then with an increase in the productivity of labor, the wage must go up to maintain a constant ratio of profits to wages. Well, what happens when the capitalists as a class see this happening is that the gains that they thought they were going to get in terms of their profit rate are eroded away as the wage rises in order to keep the value of labor power, the labor share, constant over the system as a whole. Well, this is well, from one point of view, it's important to realize that this is a prisoner's dilemma kind of situation. The capitalists somehow defeat themselves. And how do they defeat themselves? Because there are some direct consequences of their action in adopting the new techniques of production, which is to raise productivity of labor, and that actually happens. But there's some indirect effects, which is indirectly to raise the wage and maintain the labor share in output, which have the effect of defeating the goal of the capitalist of raising profit rate. If you're interested in a more detailed discussion of this, we go through this in some detail in the book that has just come out in the second edition, Growth and Distribution, with Tom Michl and Daniele Tavani. When you put this all together, you get a picture of what Duménil and Lévy call a trajectory a la Marx, and this Costas has already referred to, which is a pattern of capital accumulation in which there is fairly consistent technological change, which is raising labor productivity, but there is a parallel upward pressure on money wages to keep the wage share roughly constant. That is also, as it turns out, Kaldor's stylized fact picture of capitalist economic growth, around which, say, Solow centered his effort to theorize a growth model for capitalist for an economy. Okay, so that's a very important pattern, and you can look. There's quite a bit of empirical discussion of when it happens and when it doesn't. Some of the best of this work, I think, was done by Duménil and Lévy, and you can see it on their web page. And what they find is that in the 19th century, on the whole, this trajectory a la Marx does hold sway. That is more or less the pattern. In fact, though, what happens is there's a little tendency for capitalists to overdo it and lower the capital productivity enough to lend a small downward bias to the profit rate, which is Marx's tendency of the falling profit rate. But if you look at the 20th century, the picture becomes much more complicated. And there are both regions of the world and particular periods of capitalist accumulation in which the trajectory of Marx is not followed, in which capital productivity rises rather than staying constant or falling. And as a result, the profit rate tends to drift upwards rather than downwards. This process can also be thought of from the point of view of the incentives to the capitalists for innovation and productivity increase. And the basic incentive of the capitalist is to save money on wages. Marx is very clear on that, both in his discussion of the falling rate of profit and in his discussion earlier in volume 1 of Capital of relative surplus value. The capitalist wants to save money on wages. And how do you save money on wages? Well, you use less labor to produce whatever you're producing. That's the basic theory of induced technical change. And I would suggest that part of the answer to Costas's very important question of why we suddenly, around 1980 or 85, in advanced capitalist countries, see a cessation of the trajectory a la Marx in favor of a very different trajectory in which it's the wage that stays constant and with a corresponding fall in the value of labor power and rise in the profit wage ratio. Why this hugely important historical event took place. In my mind, it probably has something to do with the globalization and liberalization of investment, making another path of capitalist profitability viable, namely the path of relocating production to low-wage regions of the world. In my mind, this is a point that I assume that Armando and Chico are going to have something to say about this. One key question here is the trajectory a la Marx still operating at the world scale? What's happening to the world division between profits and wages and to world productivity in the globalization period? Okay, let me just turn as a final discussion to put on the table and get you thinking about to the question of whether to the idea that one consequence of this way of looking at capitalist production, which is that the capitalists aren't getting what they want. They're getting something different. They may be getting something they can live with, but they're not getting a linear realization of their own goals. If their goal was to raise the rate of profit, they're suddenly faced in the Marxian scenario with forces that tend to lower the rate of profit, or at least prevent it from rising very rapidly. This suggests to me that an important part of the politics of capitalism is the division of interests in the capitalist class. That the capitalist class does not have monolithically consistent political interests. And the divisions in the capitalist class are a key element in successful political reforms. Now, this topic is not, you're not going to find a lot on this in Marx, because this is all about defensive class struggle. That is, this is about, okay, we're not going to be able to overturn the whole capitalist scheme of productive organization, but what can you do anything to make people's lives better within that framework? Marx argued, well, not a whole lot, and from his own political point of view was very much at pains to insist that there was no real ultimate solution to the problems of capitalism, to inequality and exploitation, except to overturn the structure of the system as a whole. But if we are actually, as we tend to be, stuck for some period, maybe not so long or maybe a little longer than we would like, with the capitalist framework of production for a variety of reasons, then the question of where do you get some effective political movement that actually improves people's lives, where can you find that kind of political economy? Now, an example of this is in the other piece that I circulated as a background, which is Catherine Moose's discussion, which was published out of her thesis work at the New School on the Factory Acts, which is one of the earliest occasions in which there was political intervention to regulate capitalism. And the particular kind of regulation that the Factory Acts represented was to try to limit the rate of exploitation of labor. Now, you can have two different views about the politics behind this. One view would be, well, it's always in the interest of the capitalists to exploit labor more. So this must have been a direct confrontation between the interests of capital and the interests of labor, in which labor managed to get enough leverage, direct leverage, and leverage through alliances with other classes to impose something on the capitalists that they didn't want. But there's another way of thinking about this, which actually I think is there's some good reason to take seriously, which is that the kind of exploitation of labor that was going on in 1840s Britain was another example of unintended consequences. The capitalists, the individual capitalists, were getting signals from the market to push the exploitation of labor way higher than was in the interest of the capitalist class as a whole. But they were in a prisoner's dilemma, and they could not avoid individually taking the steps which were not in their class interests. If you look at it from this point of view, then that suggests that the reason that the Factory Acts could find political footing was that the advocates of the Factory Acts managed to divide the capitalist class, so that the class coalitions that led to the passage of the Factory Acts included some sectors of capitalism, capitalists as advocates for regulation. And you can see a lot of reasons why that would be true, and which particular, you could think which particular types of capitalists would be most interested in getting other capitalists regulated as far as how much they exploited labor. Why would it be an excess exploitation of labor? Because there are huge externalities involved in the exploitation of labor, which come through very clearly in the, say, pictures of Manchester in Britain in the 1840s, where living conditions were absolutely horrible. Lifespan was declining rapidly, and it's impossible to imagine that you could go forward to a more progressive technological basis for capitalism with an ill-clad, ill-fed, ill-housed, ill-educated working class, which was the outcome of this unbridled orgy of exploitation. And in fact, as it turned out, the Factory Acts were the first in a series in Britain and then in other countries of attempts to regulate exploitation, which on the whole has been very good for the capitalist class as a class, even though it may appear contrary to the interests of individual capitalists. So this example has two themes that we might want to talk about a little bit more. For example, in the case of global warming and climate change policy, there's been a tendency on the left to present that issue as just a two-class issue. The capitalists are on the bad side. They're just they just have the incentives to wreck up the environment. And the only thing to do is to form a united front against them and force them into compliance with some kind of regulation to limit, let's say, greenhouse gas emission and global warming. But there's another way you could look at it and say, well, maybe that's not so true. There are probably capitalist firms that are going to take huge hits from climate damage. And there are other capitalist firms who are going to pay very few costs to meet the regulations required to avoid climate damage. What maybe there's a room for cross-class political coalitions to pursue the practical end of controlling greenhouse gas emissions without necessarily thinking that it's going to have to involve the wholesale reform of capitalist social relations. Maybe we want a wholesale reform of capitalist social relations, but it's an even bigger job than controlling greenhouse gases and global warming. Well, that's one example. I don't know if that will catch anybody's attention or what you might think about this. But let me end up by just saying a couple of things about where we are, where the left is politically, and why I think these kinds of considerations need to be pushed more into the center of the debate in terms of left policy and left politics. See, I think the global warming example makes this point very well. I don't think we're on the verge of knowing how to reform capitalist social relations and still maintain a viable division of labor and high levels of productivity and standard of living at this point. I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk that Marx's own belief that you could do that by substituting some kind of top-down centralized control of production has worn very thin in the 20th century. There are other ways of making some fundamental changes in capitalist social relations, such as workers' control or various forms of market socialism, where we do have some track record, especially in Eastern Europe in the latter days of the Soviet Union. And we know much more about how life might work under those systems. But really tackling that issue is even more formidable than tackling the issue of, say, global warming or limiting inequality, which we are not having much luck doing. I think the more likely strategies to be successful would be ones that drew their inspiration from historical episodes like the Factory Acts, tried to divide the capitalist class, go for a politics and a political economy of cross-class coalitions, which would allow which would not directly challenge the overall framework of capitalist social relations, but would allow the correction of egregious excesses, just as the Factory Acts did. So I think that's about my time limit, and I will yield the floor.
Thank you, Duncan. Can you hear me? I'm not
Yes,
sure.
I agree. I turned
Okay.
it on mute, but okay.
Thank you, Duncan. This was very broad-ranging and sharp at the same time in the expected fashion. I have only one question to ask in light of what you presented, and then I will give the floor to the students. I take what you said about the 20th century, but if we look at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st, we see that productivity growth and the kind of model that Marx develops in his classic book, the first volume of Das Kapital particularly, can still be observed in Asia. I mean, if we look at Asia, key parts of it, China to a certain extent, and elsewhere, we see the extremely rapid productivity growth and the kind of exploitation of labor that is not as vicious and as destructive as what we had in England in the 1840s and 1850s, but it's still very severe. And it is this disparity that to me is very interesting. Why is it that we see an attenuation of the model, as you pointed out, in the core countries, a slowdown of productivity growth, and not a Marx-like pattern of development of capitalism at the core of the system? But at the same time, we see what I think are, to a certain extent, Marx-like phenomena elsewhere, and a great disparity of productivity growth in the two parts of the world, which might rebound in the interests of capitalists at the core, and even allow workers at the core to take advantage of the goods cheaply produced in the East, while their own wages remain constant in value terms. I wonder if you've got any insights on that in light of what you said. I wonder if you can cast any light on this.
Well, I do have some ideas about it. I wish they were a little better developed, and I wish I had a little better empirical basis for judging which of them makes sense. But let me try. These points can be very complicated, so and I don't want to get into too much esoteric discussion of how you measure productivity and questions of that kind. But what happened in the 80s and the 90s, say in the United States, which we have is a pretty clear example. Well, up until the 1980 or so, there was pretty vigorous upward pressure on wages in the United States. The 1970s were a period of quite intense class conflict. A lot of strikes, a lot of upward pressure on wages, posed a huge dilemma for the Federal Reserve as to whether to authorize the upward movement of wages and allow inflation, or to, as the monetarists wanted at that time, hold the line and force a high enough level of unemployment or austerity, as Claire Mattei explains in her book, to dissipate these wage pressures. Well, that isn't what happened in the 1980s. In the 1980s, because of the liberalization of investment in the flows in the world, the lifting of capital controls, capitalists had another channel by which to maintain the rate of profit, which was not to increase the productivity of labor in the industrial heartlands of Europe and North America or Japan, but to just move production to lower wage regions of the world. And they did that. And this had the second unintended consequence, that because this meant downsizing and outsourcing, and it put the fear of God in the working classes of the metropolitan countries, especially maybe the United States, more than in Europe, where the working classes were better organized politically and could resist these pressures more. So so they sort of got two unintended consequences. For one, they managed to maintain the rate of profit, but they also managed to really take the wind out of the sails of upward pressure on wages. But if we believe Marx's theory and the Caldor-induced technical change, what do we predict is going to happen when you allow for stagnation of wages? Lance Taylor explains this very, very clearly in the wonderful book he wrote about inequality just before he died with Özlem Omer. Well, you would say, well, if wages aren't rising very fast, you're not going to get very much increase in productivity either, are you? Because the incentive for the increase in productivity is to save money on labor. So that's looking at it from the point of view of the metropolitan capitalist countries. And I think that's more or less what happened. Productivity stagnated because wages stagnated, not the other way around. If you look at it from the point of view of China, let's say, as the sort of poster child of the other side of this, well, from the Chinese point of view, the 90s and the 2000s were a period that did bring something like the trajectory a la Marx, or pressures towards the trajectory a la Marx, into societies that had never experienced anything like that before. And so there was some upward pressure on wages, largely politically repressed by the political monopoly of, in say, China, of the Communist Party. And on the whole, what China and South Korea and Taiwan and the other Asian miracle countries did was that they adopted high technology, but they didn't adopt it so much because it was labor cost reducing. They adopted it because it was the only way that they could enter the world market with high quality output, with high quality products. Alice Amsden tells this story in several of her books about, especially about Korea. So you get so then the question to my mind empirically is, yes, you get a kind of a trajectory a la Marx starting in the East Asian countries. But is it really that, or, and in particular, is it a trajectory a la Marx at the level of the world capitalist economy as a whole? And that is, in the world capitalist economy, is the wage share remaining reasonably constant and productivity vigorously increasing? I don't think so. But I'm not aware of enough empirical work to firm up that opinion.
I see. Okay, enough of this more esoteric stuff. Let's open up the discussion now. I'd like to invite our two students, Armando in the first place. I keep following him. I will now keep quiet and cede the floor to students and to the audience more generally.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be commenting, especially after Professor Foley. Let me share my screen because I want to show you my presentation. So what I'm going to talk about is some consideration on Marx theory of productivity for developing countries, and especially in the context of internationalization of production as a way to counterbalance this falling profit rate. So at the beginning, let me define quickly the profit rate. The profit rate is equal to 1 minus the real wage divided by the labor productivity, and this is multiplied by capital productivity. So in general terms, what we are talking about when we're talking about the falling rate of profit is that the capital productivity is being reduced, while this ratio between the real wage and the labor productivity is constant or almost constant. So of course, the profit rate will fall. However, if we increase the competition among workers, then it's possible that when labor productivity is increasing, then the real wage will be constant, and then this will counterbalance this problem. So I would like to argue that, exactly as Professor Foley was mentioned, that after the 80s, the 90s, we have had a process like this where the internationalization of production has allowed for more competition between workers, and then a wage share that is falling. And here's a quote from Professor Foley that mentions something similar that has happened after that period. And the main idea is that even if the capital productivity is falling, if the wage share is falling as well, then you're able to control in somehow the falling of the profit rate. And here we have the productivity growth versus the real wage growth for selected Latin American countries, depending on the data between 2000 and 2019. And if the productivity is growing at the same rate that the real wage, then all the points will be in this red line. And we can see that the majority of countries are in the upper side of this red line, which means exactly that the wage share is falling. This is an approximation. It's not exactly accurate, because here I'm using the data from ECLAC, and they are using the consumer price index, but I think is a useful approximation. But then, even if you are avoiding the falling on the profit rate, this is not less problematic. Of course, this means an increasing inequality between capitalists and workers, but also I would like to discuss some problems in the developing countries. So here is self-employment versus productivity, and as you can see, when productivity is increasing, self-employment is decreasing. So I want to use this self-employment as a proxy of informality. The International Labor Organization takes into account self-employment as informality, and it's an important proportion. So let me use it as a proxy of informality. And I have this quote from Laporta and Shelford, and that they point out that usually people is in the informal sector because they are not able to get a job in the formal sector. So they are using this space as an alternative because they don't have an alternative. In that sense, I would like to argue that the self-employment or the informality is close to the idea of reserve army of labor, especially in developing countries where you don't have an additional income coming from unemployment security or anything else. And usually the argument is that the high level of self-employment generates low level of productivity. And of course, this makes sense because you have individual workers, and so the division of labors within these firms of self-employment is not that high. However, I would like to argue that there might be also some low level of productivity might also generate high level of self-employment. And let me explain a little bit about that. Here we have the accumulation rate versus the profit rate for selected Latin American countries. Here again, I'm using this specific data because with this data set, you can take away some sectors like construction and electricity and water, where usually the government will intervene. So this allows us to see the capitalist relationship. So as you can see, there's a positive correlation between the profit rate from one period and lag and the accumulation rate. So in the case that you have low rates of productivity, then it's possible that you will have low rates of accumulation. But the problem is that the process of accumulation at the same time guides the change on technology. So it's possible that this will generate low level of productivity. And at the same time, if you have low rates of accumulation and employment is guided by that, you may have problems with higher informality sector. So you have a higher reserve army of labor, which at the same time might constrain the increase of wages, which means that there will not be incentive to increase technology because you will try to compete through wages instead of new technology. And this low level of productivity, especially in open economies, as we're talking in the internationalization of the production, might generate low level of competitiveness, and at the same time, this low level of competitiveness will generate low rates of profit. So I have named this the low level of productivity cycle that some countries in the developing countries might be facing. Let me give you the example of El Salvador, not just because it's my country, but because I think it's useful to understand the situation of some countries. So, some context, El Salvador is a small open economy. We apply a lot of the consensus, Washington consensus, including we have free trade agreements with the United States, we have free trade agreement with Mexico, we have free trade agreement with the European Union. So we are competing a small economy, we are competing with developed countries. And as you can see here in this graph, the profit rate of the tradable goods, such as agriculture and manufacture, is low in comparison with the non-tradable goods. So this implies a low level of accumulation in this sector. And this is in line with what Foley, Michl, and Tavani mentioned, that in these countries, we got a disindustrialization process. And I think it's because the incentives are not in this sector, especially in open economies. And also, the idea that the problem that it generates is that, as I will show in the next slide, is that it might generate low level of employment, and it pushes you to export labor. As an example, El Salvador, the remittances are around 20–25% of the GDP, but there are more countries like in the same situation. And one of the problems with traditional policies in developed countries with open economies is that at first, for example, your fiscal policy may have problems. Imagine you increase your public expenditure, even if you are expending in the non-tradable goods. The problem is that when you're buying inputs, maybe they will come from the tradable goods, but since you're not, you don't have a good productivity, then it's possible that you will import directly or indirectly those tradable goods. The same when you increase the income through public expenditure, the wages, for example, might be spent on imports as well. Regarding the monetary policy, you have capital outflows constraint because you're not able to move the interest rate whenever you want, because you have to consider the possibility that capital will move out of your economy. And finally, this idea of wage-led economy is also difficult to imagine, because even post-Keynesian and structuralist economists recognize that this will generate an appreciation on your real exchange rate that it might imply a lot. You will need more imports in that sense, because you're not able to compete. So traditional policies are problematic, and we can consider no-traditional policies such as the supply-side policies. That means public investment in productive sectors like manufacture and agriculture. But I think this is not less problematic for different things. First of all, again, this makes pressures on the balance of payment, because usually capital goods are imported, so you have to consider that specific problem. Secondly, an increase in productivity might generate unemployment. You can imagine, for example, in the agricultural sector, you may have problems if you increase your productivity because a lot of people is working there. Third, you will have, of course, political constraints, because the capitalist sector will be against the public sector investing directly in productive sectors. And fourth, there might be coordination problems among developing countries. And what I'm trying to say here, for example, if El Salvador is improving the productivity, it's possible that other countries will fall in this idea of low rates of productivity. So if we are thinking in a working class as a whole in the international sphere, then this is not, maybe this is not the best solution for this problem. So let me conclude. And first of all, the globalization and labor competition might be a counterbalance for the falling rate of profit, but this is also problematic, especially for developing countries that may go through a cycle of low level of productivity. In this cycle, the traditional economic policies might not be efficient to solve the problem, and we also have problems with the supply policies if we're not considering this specific problem that I have mentioned. Thank you so much. I wait for Duncan's comment.
Armando, very nice, and you have some very good empirical support for the general point of view. I think the picture that you draw is very characteristic for Central American and Caribbean and other similar economies in some other parts of the world, West Africa, which is that the regime of liberalization of investment flows and liberalization of investment left these countries pretty well out of the picture altogether. I mean, I don't mean to laugh at it. I think it's a horrible thing that was done, but you see this exact pattern. They're not, all the investment, as far as I can see, in countries like El Salvador is predominantly in service sectors and retail. So their economy is essentially an economy of distribution, not of production. There might be a few surviving but declining traditional comparative advantage industries, coffee production or I don't know what, but they're not growing and they're not going to absorb much labor. So the only way that these countries can make their way in the world is to export labor. I think this is a huge gap in America, in the U.S. understanding of what's going on, say with the immigration issues that seem to bother American voters so very much. The point is that that in adopting the Washington Consensus, you made it almost inevitable that the Central American and Caribbean economies would be exporting labor. Where are they going to export labor to? So, they're going to export labor to the United States because it's the big market nearby. This is another example, in my view, of what I would call unintended consequences. We thought of liberalization of investment flows as a way to rationalize global production and increase overall standards of living. But it's not just in the Rust Belt in North America, but also in Central America and the Caribbean, that it had huge deleterious consequences on the coherence of the political economy of those countries.
Hello. Hi. Well, Shakib, I was going to say thank you, Duncan, for your presentation. It was very interesting and educational. I come from a slightly different background, so it's really, I learned a lot from it. So thank you, and thank you, Amado, for your one. It was very, very interesting. I'm going to go from a slightly different perspective. Rather than look at a whole systemic, I want to focus a bit more on a microeconomics of understanding technological change. I know it's a bit of a break, but my PhD more focuses on looking at how business cycles influence learning innovation within firms and clusters, and its relation to knowledge, relatedness between knowledge and industries. So I thought maybe I want to quickly discuss what does it mean, how do we understand production and innovation and, knowledge within a firm. So just if we think what we see with the capitalists since the Industrial Revolution and capitalism emerged, we see a growth in, world income, but only in certain regions. Now, this is, of course, related times with colonialization, but something that's really that we see in there is this constant innovation that underpins capitalist economy and production in it. That essentially, well, if you compare our lives now to maybe 200 in the 14th, 15th century, right? If you think in the 11th, 12th century, what you were doing now would be very similar to what your granddad was doing or your great grandma. You know, for generations to do something very similar. One, there wasn't much flow between, you know, industries in labor, but even just what you're physically doing in those industries was quite constant over time. That you could go 200 years in the future, there'll be some changes, but not fundamentally different. Whereas if we think in this modern era, we have, you know, within 20, 30 years, we're doing something very different to what we were doing, you know, 20 years ago. So we see this growth in innovation or the rate of innovation within the capitalist economy from the Industrial Revolution. Now, from a systemic point of view, we can discuss creative destructions and the compulsions within the system to generate income. I'm saying with unintended consequences that every individual firm or individual entrepreneur or innovator would, you know, has a compulsion to innovate, because if not, someone else is going to innovate and take on the production activity increase. But well, there's a social and more systemic discussion on innovation productivity. There's also on the micro side of understanding a firm. If we think about the way we usually understand the firm, it's just usually, or production is an input-output function, where we have set inputs of labor and capital, and it goes into a function, and we have some sort of output. Now, within this usual conceptualization of production, in innovation or technological change can come in really either by changing the production function to make a input more productive, so labor more productive, capital more productive, or a new output. Now, we usually see it's somewhere in these production functions where labor usually becomes more productive or capital. So you might find vintage capital models such as ones in Roma, where the investment in capital leads to new vintages of capital being introduced, meaning labor productivity increases. Or you'll find something where they discuss learning by doing, where experience and the more you produce, the more you learn, and the more learning there is. So within this model, and then there could also be another one where you change the output and to something that has a higher value. Perhaps you're thinking that it sells, so you increase profitability. Now, within this, there's to understand where does learning innovate? How does a firm learn or innovate? Or how does it come to produce a new product or a new system? There's a lack of explanation of it. If it's kind of you invest money, you put money in. Investment innovation is treated as if it's a function itself. You throw money in and you'll get some sort of output out, usually a new thing of capital or more labor productivity, or a new product that has high value. But how this actually emerges and how a firm comes from producing comes to dominate a market or innovate to change in a new product, it's not really explained. So for example, if we think in terms of some of the changes we see in our lifetime, we can't really explain, if we just take a normal production function, how Apple has come to dominate the mobile phone market, right? I think we all remember the early 2000s and even late 90s and the 1990s, where Nokia was really the domineering force in the mobile phone market. They had a lot of the market share of the mobile phone market, and then we see within maybe 10-15 years now, it's shared between Apple and Samsung. Now, how do we explain that, the rise of Apple and Samsung and the relative decline of Nokia in this market? We cannot really explain it simply through just Apple investing or the greater labor productivity. It's not Apple just investing in, because Nokia will be investing as well into the next generation mobiles. So is Apple. So why is it that Apple has managed to come to dominate the market and Samsung rather than Nokia? Now, to understand this, we need to think kind of about the role of knowledge in production and how we understand and conceptualize knowledge. That if we think about production, it requires a use of certain inputs. That this is something taken from the papers. You require certain inputs and you combine it with capabilities or knowledge, basic knowledge components in certain tasks in production, and you then have to organize this out. So in explaining this, for example, how Nokia has come to dominate, Apple has come to dominate the mobile phone market over Nokia, you can think about the history of the firm and what it was producing and how what it produces now, or the new innovation, is related to what it produced before. So if we think about the modern phones, the iPhones and the smartphones, they're more like a handheld computer compared to the old mobile phones, which was more focused on actual the network and telecommunications. So really we see the reason why you could say somewhere like Apple, for example, has come to dominate the mobile phone market is because they had experience previously from building their own computers, the Mac, and then even the iPods and the iTunes and that, of building their own hardware and systems that go with it. So essentially they were building their own computers and the software that went with it. So the switch from going to building laptops and computers to these iPhones, to the iPhones and these smartphones, was they had to learn less things. They had to gain less knowledge and capabilities compared to somewhere like Nokia, which only really had experience with telecommunication devices. And that's why you see now Nokia is more to do with the infrastructure of telecommunication. So one of the key things to understanding the trajectory of, I would say, a firm, but also locations as well. If we think about if we think about a region in a country and how it's developed over time, we can often think about what was there before and how the path-dependent process of how has it come out to where we are now. So, for example, I think it was Michael Best. I gave an example of Lowell's in Massachusetts, how it's now grown with the modern engineering, how it came out from the past with Wang factories, right? So when you think about these capabilities, they're essentially a knowledge input into the production function. Now, we have to be careful when to define what we mean by knowledge input and knowledge, because it's not the same as other inputs. It's not tradable. Like maybe capital, you can trade it a lot easier. It can flow easier, but knowledge does not. The reason why is knowledge that you find within a firm is often collective in nature. It is formed from experience of teams and communities and the structure of an organization. And a lot of it remains tacit as well. So for example, if I ask you how to ride a bike, you can give me instructions how to ride a bike. You can write it down, but there's some skills that you cannot discuss. There's some things that you might not quite know. So there's also this tacit nature. With it being partly embedded within the labor of the firm, and it's shaped by experiences, means it's socially shaped by conversations we have together, and we also find it's locationally based. Yeah, I think that's it. Sorry. Thank you. Duncan?
Sure. Do you want to stop your screen sharing, Turkey?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks. That's a very interesting survey of the innovation side of the processes that we've been talking about. And clearly that's a hugely fascinating part of the economic history story. If you get into looking at past episodes of rapid technological change, for example, the stories are just fascinating. What happened to aircraft, exactly how one or another technology was developed, the very gradual convergence of aircraft design on a small number of alternative models and so forth. The only, in listening to your presentation, which I thought was very interesting, and maybe some people have some more questions about it, are there two things that well, one big thing, and that has maybe two aspects to it. The big thing is, you know, I think economics really has to get over the production function. Because I'm worried that the production function is getting to be more of a lead weight than a buoyancy device for ideas in a couple of ways. One is, and they're connected with your discussion. Well, how do we measure output? Well, we tend to measure output by value added. Well, okay, now suppose you have reasonably stable world market prices, then value added is not a bad measure, a single index measure of productivity in some broad sense. But what we're talking about now with these monopolies like Apple or the Google or the financial industry, there's no well-defined value added in the financial industry. The financial industry basically runs on how much money can each productive employee generate. But is that money necessarily represent anything real that they're producing? No, it just means that they're getting some kind of competitive advantage. And that competitive advantage may very well have to do with changing the relative prices at which things are exchanging, rather than making more of something to exchange at relatively constant prices. So I worry that the framework, we have to be much more critical about the framework that we use to measure productivity. Really, what value add, because we know from, let's say, Marx's theory, that the value added in a sector is endogenous because of the adjustment of prices through competition, say, to tend to equalize rates of profit. And the other thing that your discussion made me worry about the production function is that it tends to be a kind of straitjacket in our thinking about the actual process of human creativity. So when you think about it, as you outlined, if you start from a production function, you think, well, what is innovation about? Innovation must be an output, so it must be related to some input. Well, what is that input exactly? Well, maybe it's money, R&D expenditure, or something of that kind. That particular point of view, I think, has turned out to be extremely unhelpful. The attempt to measure R&D production functions doesn't work very well. Now, it's certainly true that R&D of new products, let's look at, say, the bio industry. Developing new drugs or new medical treatments costs a huge amount of money. But what is that money getting spent on? Is it getting spent on generating ideas exactly? Or is it getting spent on things like conducting clinical trials to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of the product? Well, those are completely different things. It seems to me that the generation of the ideas, we might be better off going back to some kind of model based, as Michl wanted economics to be based in biology, to look at models of evolution or mutation and genetic change as the source of the new ideas. And then the big question is, if you have this big pool of potentially developable technologies and products, where do you put the money effectively to turn any of them into a profitable investment?
Okay, so now we are going to move to the Q&A, and let me start. So we have two questions to start. One is from Daniel Osa, a PhD candidate from the University of Utah, and he asks how to overcome the contradiction between increasing inequality and due to the decoupling of wages and productivity and the falling rate of profit if wages grow along productivity. And the second question is Kival Baradio, a master student from, he's a master from Werbeck. And the question is, why do we need growth and productivity when we have vast accumulation of wealth, financialized profits, and an overproduction and waste under capitalism?
Okay, I can see this is going to be quite a bit of tennis, pushing the tennis ball back across the net for me. Well, those are two very different questions. So let me address the first one first, because it's closely connected to one of the themes I tried to develop in my talk. See, I think that capitalism, if you look at capitalism as a historical phenomenon, it's a kind of a bargain with the devil. Because there's no doubt that it delivers, compared to any other historically known mode of organization of human activity, it does produce higher standards of living and higher potential quality of life. Now, why does it do that? Well, if you look carefully at what the Adam Smith and Marx, as a follower, I believe, of Adam Smith, have to say, it's because capitalism, it's because inequality in capitalism is deeply intertwined with average performance. The whole idea of the capitalist system is to give signals to people as to which part of the division of labor they ought to be heading towards at the particular moment that they are going through the life cycle. If you start suppressing those signals, then you're going to get less effectiveness in the allocation process. So I think you face a fundamental difficulty, fundamental trade-off between inequality and income performance. We are very concerned about inequality, but look at Piketty's research carefully. Where we are now in terms of inequality is still not as much inequality as, say, in the 1920s in the United States. I mean, we're getting back towards it, and it's pretty clear we're going to get there eventually. Well, how much equality or inequality do you want? I mean, and how do you talk about that question? It's a very difficult question to talk about. John Romer has tried to write a number of papers from a theoretical point of view, putting some kind of limits on how much equality you could have and still get the benefits of capitalist production. So you can't, I think it's living in a little bit of a dream world to imagine that there isn't that kind of trade-off. Which brings us to the second question, which is, why are we so interested in rising income to begin with? Well, I don't know what you all think about that. I'm not particularly interested in a higher standard of living for myself, but I happen to have lived in a very unusual, to have lived as a very unusually privileged person in a very unusually privileged part of the world and at a very unusually privileged time in world history. So I think if everybody could have more or less the standard of living that I have, that would be okay. I wouldn't worry about having to be increased a whole bunch more. But look, I'm aware that most people in the world don't have anything like the standard of living that I've had. So maybe you're willing to give up on material standard of living, but I would think really hard and twice about whether you really believe that or not.
Okay, thank you. The next question from Giovanni from Birkbeck, is a PhD student in the politics department at Birkbeck University, London. Ask you, Duncan, about productive labour. In Capital Volume 2, all labour necessary for circulation of money or capital, or C prime M prime, is defined by Marx as unproductive, ranging from advertising to sale or legal services. However, in Capital 1, everything that can be sold in the market is a commodity. Is it not a contradiction?
Well, I don't read Capital Volume 1 as saying anything that can be sold in the market is a commodity. It's true that Marx is a little sloppy about his language about commodity production, but I think you can give some discipline to that discussion by especially starting with the concept of use value in Adam Smith. Much of what we call unproductive labor does produce a use value, but it's a derived use value. It's derived only because of the social relations of production in which the activity occurs. That's certainly true of finance, right? I mean, there's no doubt that if you live in a highly financialized world, then financial expertise can appropriate money and therefore seems to have a kind of a productivity. But we know that it's derivative, right? It doesn't have to do with the houses we live in or the clothes that we wear or the food that we eat. It only has to do with the context.
Yep.
Oh,
thank you.
if you're interested, you might want to look at the discussion of Isaac Rubin, I. Rubin, in his essays on Marx's theory of value, which for a variety of reasons, because he was writing in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, this question of what was productive labor and what was not productive labor became very important. And Rubin has a number of very helpful suggestions as to sensible ways to try to distinguish.
Thank you. And the next question comes from Spencer. He says, in Marx's time, factory workers were fighting for 10 hours a day, which some may argue has led to the unintentional emergence of a specifically capitalist mode of production. Does this imply that similar types of regulation today can unintentionally lead to an even more capitalist form of capitalism?
Well, in general, yes. I mean, you can make bad mistakes. Or I would, and in some cases, the mistakes aren't really mistakes, but they are unintended consequences. Take the issue of the growth of female labor force participation in advanced economies. What's really behind that? Well, there's several different things behind that, but one of the good things, in my view, behind it is that it's a way that women can realize their own lives and their own potential more, and so it's a good thing in itself. Did it have unintended consequences? Yes, it did, because once the ideal of the single breadwinner family had been diluted, it gave a big opening to the capitalists to increase the rate of exploitation by not by paying men or women less, but by paying the combination of men and women's labor less than proportional to the amount of labor that the capitalists were getting. And that's certainly been a huge change in the broad sense of the way the society functions. So yes, you can make big mistakes, and I think that one of the roles of educated political economists is to be a sort of keep on the lookout for where there are these contradictions starting to develop, and find some way to communicate to the broader progressive left where the progressive left may be getting into dangerous territory.
Okay, so the next question is from Claude Ryan, a master student of social, ecological, economics, and policy at Vienna. And it says, I would be very interested in Professor Foley's opinion on the degrowth movement as means of reducing our social metabolisms, material and energy consumption.
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm not very impressed by the degrowth movement, and I think it's probably on the wrong track. It seems to me that I tend to be a pragmatist, and you can tell from my remarks about do you want to have higher incomes, real incomes. I think the idea is to have as high a standard of living and to have as much freedom and for self-development as you can with as little damage to the environment as you can manage. We don't do that at all. There's been practically no attempt to adapt modes of production to environmental damage or minimize the environmental damage of income production. And the degrowth movement seems to me to make two errors in that respect. One is they tend to assume that whatever is right now, let's say the carbon footprint or the environmental damage of capitalist production, is somehow a given, but it's not. It's from a long period point of view, that's endogenous. You can change the amount of damage you're doing to any particular part of the environment in a huge number of ways if you want to do that. And the other idea that the degrowth movement, I think, really gets, well, at least I don't understand their advocacy of it, is why do you want a lower standard of living? You want as high a standard of living as you can get. That's just pragmatism. What you don't want are the unpleasant side effects.
And second question is from Jacob Heyer from the University of Jena in Germany. And it says, Professor Foley, could you relate your views on Marx's theory of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall to your view on the classical Marxian labor theory of value?
I'm not sure I got the last little bit of the question, Armando. Could you?
Let me say that again. It says, could you relate your views on Marx's theory of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall to your view on the classical Marxian labor theory of value?
It's just the last word, value. I'm not sure what that word is. Value.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that.
Theory of value. Well, in a way, I tried to structure the talk around that. Look, you're not going to have induced technical change unless you have capitalist commodity production to start with, in the sense that what you're producing, you're selling on the market. It's only on that as a exchange value and not a use value. It's only in that context that it makes any sense to even think about technical change. So to my mind, the interesting wrinkle in the insight that you get from Marx's discussion is this one of the self-defeating element in the process, that the capitalists, think they're going to get a higher profit rate because they compute what's going to happen at the given wage, but they don't take into account of the fact that their collective activity is going to make the wage endogenous and at a social level. And in many ways, it can just erode away whatever advantage they get from the technical change to begin with.
The next question is from is from Charles April from SOAS, University of London. He asks, I want to explore the applicability of tactics of elite division beyond Dr. Duncan Foley's example of the worldwide environmental movement. What may some of the promises and pitfalls of a Labour strategy that aligns strategically with segments of capital against others, keeping in mind competition as well as productivity and wage effects? What sectors for / contexts may this kind of strategy be more viable?
Well, that's a big question. And when you start getting into detailed politics, is where I think a huge amount of careful homework and empirical investigation is called for. So I have some feel in the case of the United States for what kind of political coalitions might form around environmental issues if there was any disposition to have cross-class coalitions on environmental issues. I mean, it's not hard to predict which elements of the capitalist class could be peeled off into an environmental political coalition. In fact, to a considerable degree, that already happens. One of the problems is that the space of political strategies that people have talked about has been limited, and in particular, there's been very little talk about paying off fossil fuel energy owners for the losses that they would sustain if you had a successful decarbonization. Well, once you start thinking that way, you can see a number of possibilities. Some of them are not going to work well. Some of them are going to work better. What about international coalitions? Well, look, there's no doubt that the globalization has increased incomes in a lot of regions of the world very dramatically. Are you going to just ignore that as you're trying to think about what your political attitude towards globalization is? Or do you have to take it into account? I think you have to take it into account. Do I know enough to tell you what the right coalition is? No, absolutely I do not. I've spent some time with various graduate students who worked on one or another part of that question. For example, Armando's discussion of the situation in Central America and the Caribbean focused very sharply on the informal labor market and the question of whether the informal labor market really represented self-employment or it represented a kind of disguised wage labor relationship. Well, I think that's really important to understand quantitatively if you're going to base some politics around it. You don't know, who are these people? What are their lives like? What can you offer them realistically?
Thank you. Next question's from Baragain Camila, who's a PhD student in sociology at the Autonomous University of Puebla in Mexico. She asks, value criticism theory, specifically as read in Poststone's Time, Labor and Social Domination, suggests that capital's long-term tendency to increase productivity renders production based on labor time increasingly anachronistic, which has very destructive economic, social, political, and environmental consequences. What are your thoughts on this idea, or on value creation or value criticism theory in general?
Well, first of all, I was just going to react to the huge variety, the fact that this mode of discussion can bring people from so many different parts of the world into interaction with each other. It's a really amazing thing. Michl Postone is somebody whom I have a lot of, whose work I admire very much. and not necessarily means that I would agree with every part of it. I think one wants to look very carefully at the phrase that you put into your question about the anachronism of the labor theory of value. As far as I can see, there is no anachronism of the labor theory of value if one carefully understands that it has to do with the exploitation of productive labor, and the fact that productive labor is still the source of use values. That's, I don't think that's changed. I don't think it's going to change. What I see happening in this discussion is a confusion, which is very much, which is to some degree encouraged by some sloppiness in Marx's terminology. The confusion between modes of production of surplus value in the exploitation of labor and modes of realization of surplus value through the competition of capitals. And the reason that Marx's language tends to allow for that is that he uses the word surplus value to mean both things. Because in his mind, they were the same, at least at the level of the system as a whole. The unpaid labor was the surplus value at the level of the, but it really would help us to say, no, well, but really, let's be more careful. Unpaid labor is labor that's expended beyond the value of, that has a value equivalent that's larger than the wage that was paid. But in saying something like that, you even have a problem, because what does that word value equivalent mean? Well, it has to be the value equivalent at the level of the system as a whole. Because if you start thinking, well, what does he mean by value equivalent? It must mean the amount of money that that particular capitalist generates as value added. That's not it. Because that, as I said earlier, the value added is endogenous in Marx's for any particular capital. And so it's so I think if you stick with the logic of the framework, it'll help you more than trying to change some basic assumptions or something like that.
Okay, so we have a question from John.
This might have to be the last one.
Okay. It says, how can our discussion over productivity in the economic production sphere account for and connect with the social reproductive work taking place in the household? One of the arguments of Nancy Fraser, for example, is that the limits to the working day and the rate of exploitation by the famous acts of industrial capitalism have a predominantly gender dimension, which was associated with the squeeze of social reproduction time from the extended participation of the industrial proletarian family into economic production from sun up to sundown. How should we approach this issue?
Well, I like that question very much, although I know Nancy Fraser and I talk with her some, and I am well aware that that it's very hard to go up against Nancy Fraser and win if you take the opposite point of view to Nancy Fraser. And look, what she's saying there is absolutely true. The regulation of waged labor time, and which has to do with the regulation of labor exploitation through wage labor, is a totally different world from the regulation of equally use value productive labor time that is not mediated by the wage in, say, domestic or family relationships. That's a very good fundamental insight. It's one that Nancy Fraser's emphasized, and also many of the other pioneering feminist economist economists. So I agree with that totally. So maybe one way, I mean, this is just if I were talking to you as a graduate student who's looking for a thesis topic, one way to think about this might be to say, well, okay, Marx has an induced technical change. Marx has some kind of a handle on the dynamics relating the wage and the substitution of labor by machines in production. What's the parallel problem for domestic production? What does determine the productivity of domestic labor? Can we find any examples where there have been big changes in the productivity of domestic labor? Now, a lot of domestic labor is care labor, and unfortunately, human metabolism has not changed a whole lot. So what you have to take care of, if you have to take care of the needs of another human being in feeding and so forth, is not very is not going to change very rapidly. But we don't bring kids up today exactly the same way as people did in the 19th century. So maybe there's something to be learned about the patterns that determine that. That would be my main suggestion there. Yes, acknowledge that these are two different spheres, and then let's find out a little bit more about the sphere we know the least about.
Okay, I think we've had enough. I think Duncan has said this. We've exhausted him. We've been at it for a long time, and we thank him greatly for spending all this time and tackling all these questions. I'd like to thank Armando and Shakib as well for all the work they've done and the effort they put into it, and all the participants for the multiple questions they've asked, different aspects, different topics, different areas that are all related to the main issue to hand. I think we'll call time for today, and thank you all for participating, and see you at the next session, which will be in a couple of weeks' time.
Right, everybody.
Thanks very much.